Beneath the shining legacy of ancient Greece lies a truth carved not in marble, but in the silent suffering of women whose names history erased. These concubines lived and died unseen, their bodies traded, their voices silenced, their humanity denied. Behind every celebrated idea of democracy and beauty was a shadow built on their exploitation. Their pain was not an accident, it was a foundation. To remember them is to strip away the illusions of a perfect past and face the cost paid in human lives. They were more than property. They were people. And their stories demand to be told. The same Athens that raised statues to wisdom kept whole streets hidden from the sunlight. Streets where women's names were forgotten within hours of arrival. Ancient Greece is often remembered for its philosophers, democratic assemblies, and artistic achievements. Yet behind this polished image existed a social class that lived without rights or recognition. These women were known as palaki, a term used for concubines who were either enslaved or otherwise bound to serve a man outside the formal status of a wife. In law and in daily life they were treated as property. A palaki could be purchased, inherited, or gifted in the same way as livestock or household goods. The contrast between what Greece preached and what it practiced could not be sharper. In public life, the Athenians spoke of justice, virtue, and the dignity of the free citizen. In private life, the same society accepted, even expected, the sexual ownership of women who had no say in their fate. These women were not seen as partners, nor even as full members of the household. Their presence was functional, to provide physical pleasure, bear children if desired, and perform duties that blurred the line between sexual service and domestic labor. The status of a palaki was codified into the social structure. A wife was the guardian of legitimate heirs. A hetaira was a companion often skilled in conversation and the arts, but the palaki existed solely to be used. No law protected her from abuse, no court would hear her complaint, and no custom allowed her to refuse her master's demands. Her worth was measured in obedience and physical appearance, not in character or personal history. Yet their treatment went beyond mere ownership. What awaited a new concubine in her first days was not simply physical exploitation. The process began long before that moment, in ways designed to remove the last traces of who she had been. But before their bodies were used, their identities were the first thing to vanish. A girl's first night as a concubine didn't begin in a bedroom. It began in a room with no mirrors. The first task was not to touch her but to strip away everything that connected her to her past. If she was a war captive, her original clothes were removed and replaced with garments that marked her as property. Her hair might be cut or restyled to follow Greek fashions, erasing the styles of her homeland. She was given a new name, often one that sounded pleasant in Greek but had no link to her own language. The old name, and with it her former identity, was never to be spoken again. Adopting Greek customs was not a choice but a requirement. She was taught to speak only Greek, sometimes punished for using her native tongue. Gestures, manners, and posture were corrected to match local expectations. Food, dress, and religious practices were replaced with those of her captors. This was more than cultural assimilation. It was a deliberate severing of ties, ensuring she could no longer find comfort or belonging in her memories. Some masters or slave trainers performed what could be called psychological, death and rebirth rituals. These might involve symbolic acts, such as making the woman kneel while her new name was declared, or forcing her to serve a meal in her new role before she had even rested from her capture. The message was clear. The person she had been was gone, and a new existence had begun, one defined entirely by her master's will. By the time this process ended, many women could barely recall the details of their former lives without pain or confusion. The transformation was complete enough that resistance seemed impossible. Once she no longer recognized herself, the market was ready to decide her worth. They were not sold like people, they were sold like season's produce. In the slave markets of cities such as Athens, Corinth, and Delos, concubines-to-be were displayed for inspection much like goods on a merchant's table. Buyers walked slowly past rows of women, judging them by age, body shape, complexion, and facial features. Teeth were checked for health, skin for blemishes, and hair for color or thickness. A well-proportioned figure or clear skin could raise the price dramatically. War captives were often the most desirable to certain buyers. Taken from conquered regions, they came with no local family ties and no one to challenge the buyer's ownership. Women from Thrace or the Black Sea region, with lighter hair and skin, were sometimes marketed as exotic prizes. Others from Asia Minor or the Levant were valued for different features. In contrast, women born into slavery, bred within slave households, might be considered more docile but less novel. Prices varied widely. A young girl in perfect health from a recently conquered territory could fetch a sum equal to several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. Older women or those with visible scars might sell for far less, sometimes in bulk sales. Traders categorized them much like livestock, placing the most premium stock at the front of the display and relegating others to the back, where buyers seeking cheaper options could bargain. The market was an organized system with its own rules, contracts, and reputation to maintain. Traders kept records of origin, age, and sale conditions, ensuring buyers could verify the quality of their purchase. But for the women themselves, being sold was not an endpoint. In truth, the moment the transaction was complete, a new phase began, one that would strip away not just freedom but the will to resist. But the market's end was only the beginning, because the real training had yet to begin. The training was not to teach pleasure, it was to erase refusal. Once purchased, a new concubine was often kept apart from the rest of the household. Isolation served a purpose. Without allies, she had no one to share her thoughts with or to remind her of the life she had before. This separation made her more dependent on the very people who controlled her. Manipulation was constant. Rewards for compliance might be better food or softer bedding, while disobedience brought punishments ranging from verbal humiliation to physical harm. Over time, these alternating pressures shaped behavior, making obedience feel like the only safe option. In some cases, trainers deliberately placed several concubines together but structured their interactions so that rivalry replaced solidarity. They might compete for attention, resources, or even small privileges, each knowing that another's gain could mean their own loss. Within the household, concubines could be given specific roles that reflected their master's preferences or needs. One might be tasked with personal service, another with managing certain domestic chores, another with entertaining guests. This division not only kept them busy but also reinforced hierarchy among them, ensuring that any unity would be fragile at best. By the end of this process, refusal became almost unthinkable. The woman who had once resisted capture now calculated every word and gesture to avoid angering those in power. This was not submission born of agreement. It was the surrender of someone whose choices had been narrowed to survival alone. Once her obedience was perfected, she would meet the one person who could both protect and destroy her. In Athens, law was the master's shield, and the concubine's cage. A palace existed outside the legal protections that applied even to many other non-citizens. She could not own property in her own name, sign a contract, or inherit anything. If she earned or created something of value, it legally belonged to her master. She was also barred from giving testimony in court, unless it was under torture and at her owner's command, which made it impossible for her to defend herself in legal disputes. Her children were no protection. In fact, the law treated them as the master's property, not as her kin in any enforceable sense. If he wished, he could sell them into slavery, give them away, or deny them any inheritance rights. The concubine had no legal standing to prevent such decisions. This lack of power was not an accidental oversight. It was part of the structure that ensured her total dependence. Greek law also permitted acts that modern eyes would see as violent crimes. A master could beat a concubine without legal consequence. Lending her to another man for sexual use was permissible, whether for profit or as a favor. In extreme cases, killing her was not prosecuted as murder but handled as the destruction of property, often resulting only in financial restitution to the owner, if she belonged to someone else. This combination of legal power and social acceptance meant that the master's will was absolute. The concubine's survival depended entirely on remaining in his favor, and even that was no guarantee against harm. The same hand that might feed or shelter her could also strike her down without warning. And when it came to their children, the cruelty reached its most calculating form. In the eyes of the law, a concubine's child was not a blessing, it was leverage. While a legitimate wife's children were automatically recognized as heirs, those born to a palak occupied a legal gray zone. Their status depended entirely on the master's decision. If it suited his interests, he could acknowledge the child, granting certain privileges or limited inheritance rights. If not, the child could be ignored, effectively erasing any claim to family or property. This uncertainty was often used to control the mother. A concubine who displeased her master risked seeing her children sold into slavery or sent away. Conversely, compliance and loyalty might be rewarded with better treatment for her offspring, though even then, security was never permanent. The master could change his mind at any time, especially if a legitimate wife later produced male heirs who might compete for inheritance. The threat of enslavement or abandonment hung over these children from birth. Many were sold young, valued as future laborers or potential concubines themselves if female. Others were left to grow up within the household but without the full rights of legitimate children, creating a constant reminder of their inferior position. In public, they might be recognized as the master's blood, but in law, they could be traded away like any other possession. For the concubine, this meant living with a permanent weapon pointed at her most vulnerable point. Protecting her child's future became inseparable from preserving her own standing, trapping her in a cycle of obedience. Even before birth, these children could be erased, sometimes with the mother in the same act. Her womb belonged to the household ledger, not her own body. In the life of a concubine, reproduction was a matter of economic calculation rather than personal choice. A master might order her to conceive if he wanted more household labor in the future, or to produce children he could sell for profit. Just as easily, he could demand she avoid pregnancy to keep her available for sexual use without interruption. Control over fertility took several forms. Forced conception could involve pairing her with the master himself or, in some cases, with other enslaved men chosen for desirable traits. Avoiding pregnancy was attempted through primitive methods, herbal mixtures, physical barriers, or periods of enforced abstinence from certain partners. These methods were unreliable and often harmful, causing lasting health problems. If a pregnancy was unwanted by the master, abortion was the likely outcome. The procedures were brutal: ingestion of toxic plants, extreme physical exertion, or deliberate blows to the abdomen. In more severe cases, crude surgical attempts were made, which carried a high risk of fatal infection or hemorrhage. The decision was entirely in the master's hands, and the woman's wishes had no legal or social weight. The danger was not only to the unborn child. Many concubines died from the complications of these forced abortions or from the lasting damage they caused. In the eyes of the household, this was simply a cost of managing property. A concubine's death from such procedures was not treated as a crime but as an unfortunate loss, to be replaced through purchase or capture. For some, death might have seemed the only release from this cycle. But in certain households, even that release was denied. And yet, even death was no guarantee of escape from servitude. In some Greek graves, the concubine lies where no freedom can reach her, beside her master. Historical accounts and later traditions suggest that in certain cases, a concubine's service did not end with her master's death. Some were expected to die alongside him, whether by suicide under pressure or through deliberate killing. In rare but striking stories, concubines were buried alive in the same grave, their deaths framed as loyalty or necessity for the afterlife. Ancient writers occasionally described these acts as ritual obligations, though it is difficult to know how common they truly were. The idea was that the master should be accompanied in death by those who had served him in life, ensuring his comfort in the next world. For the women, it meant their lives could be ended without ceremony or protest the moment their owners ended. Archaeological evidence offers unsettling hints. At certain burial sites, Researchers have found graves containing multiple bodies in arrangements that suggest simultaneous burial. Some skeletons show signs of violent death before interment. While direct proof of concubine sacrifice is rare, these findings align with the written accounts that such practices occurred, at least in specific communities or among the elite. Even when not killed, some concubines faced symbolic death after a master's passing, being discarded or sold far away, severing any remaining ties to stability. In either case, their existence was tied so completely to one man that his death determined their own fate. But not all exploitation wore the mask of death. Some of it wore the robes of religion. To the worshipper it was devotion. To the girl, it was a prison with marble columns. In some parts of the Greek world, certain temples were associated with sexual services offered in the name of the gods. Ancient sources, especially concerning Corinth, speak of women known as hierodoles, sacred slaves, who lived within temple complexes and were made available to male visitors. The payments given by worshippers went to the temple, not the women, framing the transactions as offerings rather than commerce. The religious justification was simple and powerful. By engaging in these acts, the worshipper was honoring a deity, often Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. For the women, however, this piety was simply another form of bondage. Many were brought from distant regions, cut off from their families, and kept within the temple grounds. They could not leave without permission, and their bodies were part of the institution's economic function. While historians debate the exact scale of sacred prostitution in Greece, the existence of temple-based sexual service is supported by literary references and the parallels found in neighboring cultures. In practice, it blurred the line between religious ritual and organized exploitation. The temple's prestige gave the arrangement a layer of respectability that concealed its coercive nature. For the women, the marble walls did not signify safety or holiness. They were boundaries keeping them inside, away from any chance of freedom. Even their role as servants of the goddess was not a matter of belief but of ownership. Outside the temple, an even larger network kept the supply constant. The sea routes that carried olive oil and wine also carried women who would never return home. Across the Mediterranean, established trafficking networks supplied Greek markets with a steady flow of captives. Some were taken during wars and raids, others seized by pirates who specialized in human cargo. From the shores of Thrace, Asia Minor, and the Black Sea, they were transported to port cities like Piraeus, Corinth, and Delos, where traders knew there would always be buyers. The journey itself was part of the breaking process. Captives were often chained or confined in cramped holds, with little food and no privacy. Illness spread quickly in these conditions, and those who became too sick or weak to sell were sometimes thrown overboard. Physical abuse was common, but so was psychological pressure. Threats, humiliation, and constant reminders that no one was coming to rescue them. During longer voyages, captors sometimes began the conditioning that would continue after sale. Women were forced to speak Greek, to obey basic commands, and to accept the authority of those transporting them. The goal was to make resistance seem futile before they even reached the market. By the time the ship docked, many had already learned that compliance meant survival, at least in the short term. From the dock, the path led directly to the sales platform and then to the private spaces of households. But captivity did not end once the master took possession. And once inside the household, another battle began, this time against each other. Friendship was a luxury the master could not allow. In households with multiple concubines, unity among the women posed a risk to control. To prevent this, masters and overseers cultivated an atmosphere of competition. Resources such as better food, softer bedding, or lighter workloads were given as rewards for pleasing the master, while neglect or punishment awaited those who fell from favor. The safety of one's children was another tool for division. A concubine who was granted better conditions for her child might view others as threats to that security. Rumors, minor disputes, and deliberate provocations were used to keep tensions high. Masters sometimes encouraged women to report on each other, rewarding information that painted rivals in a bad light. A hierarchy developed in which certain concubines held small privileges over others, perhaps serving meals directly to the master, managing certain domestic tasks, or being allowed more personal freedom within the household. These roles could be taken away at any moment, ensuring that loyalty was directed upward rather than sideways. Even those who wished to befriend one another risked losing their standing if seen as forming alliances. The result was a system where women were not only deprived of freedom but also turned into unwilling participants in enforcing each other's subordination. Isolation was no longer just physical. It was reinforced by mistrust and self-preservation. This rivalry, carefully maintained by those in power, ensured that resistance was fragmented and ineffective. Yet no matter how skilled a concubine became at navigating the household politics, there was one reality she could not escape. But no rivalry could delay the most feared moment, a beauty fading in the mirror. A concubine's calendar wasn't marked by seasons. It was marked by the loss of youth. In a system where her value was tied almost entirely to appearance and physical availability, aging brought an inevitable decline in status. Once a master no longer desired her, options narrowed quickly. Some women were sold to brothels, where they served clients of lower social standing until illness or exhaustion ended their usefulness. Others were simply turned out, left to survive on the streets without money, legal rights, or protection. A few remained in the household as domestic servants, performing basic chores and living in reduced circumstances. For some, this was considered a mercy, but it also meant witnessing younger women take their place, enduring the humiliation of being compared to those who had replaced them. In some cases, aging concubines were made to train the newcomers, passing on skills that would ensure the system continued. The psychological toll was deep. Years of enforced obedience and competition left many without the means or confidence to live independently. Watching one's own role diminish while helping prepare others for the same fate created a cycle of resignation that the institution relied upon. For these women, the end of beauty did not bring freedom, only a different form of captivity or abandonment. Their value in the eyes of their masters had always been conditional, and once that condition was gone, so was any pretense of care. Their bodies aged, their stories buried, but the system they endured would leave a legacy far harder to erase.